Ross Heller is a holder of a BA in history from Clark University, an MA in journalism from the University of Oregon, and has been a journalist, U.S. Senate press secretary, lobbyist, association executive, entrepreneur, and newspaper publisher. Researching by Abraham Lincoln, his 1958 time capsule, he is also a discoverer of new facts of America's most storied life, a life which no one could imagine anything new could ever be found. There's more, but in the interest of time, I'm going to just say that Ross lives in Chevy Chase, Maryland. As you just heard, has a very impressive biography. So we look forward to hearing from you, Ross.
Can I hit share screen? Let's start with that. Hello, let me get this on. Okay. Thank you, John, for that very nice introduction. I listened to all that stuff, but I wonder did I really do all that? But I did. What John didn't say was I'm also very, very new to Lincoln history. And in fact, this book that I created called By Abraham Lincoln is my first Lincoln book, and I'm really flattered to be here. I've only been a member of your society about 3 years, so this is very exciting. As John said, professionally, I'm a journalist. In fact, my journalism and my newspaper career reminds me of Lincoln's considered opinion of newspapers. They helped him in his quest to be president, and some published every single word of his debate with Douglas. And similarly, they published every word of what he said at Cooper Union. Now, of course, Lincoln was frequently and roundly criticized in the newspapers of his day. Is there anything else new with that? No. Lincoln once summed up the issue. He's told an aide, no man, whether he be private citizen or president of the U.S., can successfully carry on a controversy with a great newspaper and escape destruction unless he owns a newspaper himself. Well, enough about that. Let's go on and talk about the rabbit hole. See if we can get ourselves into the picture there. So anyhow, why a rabbit hole? That phrase comes from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And as everyone knows, Alice, in pursuit of a white rabbit, falls into the rabbit's hole and ends up in a very strange new place. Well, for me...
Excuse me, Ross, we're going to try, we saved these to broadcast in our library. So we really got to fix this. If you have the top, at the top of your computer, it says Lincoln Talk PowerPoint.
No, it doesn't. I mean, you may see it, but I don't see that.
That's strange, yeah.
Maybe you got to scroll down on your screen.
He needs to go to the bottom of his screen where the screen is, next to that slide bar. Down at the bottom, there's like a screen, like a slideshow screen. And if he goes and he clicks on that, it should open it and make it full screen.
No, I'm moving all the slides up and down.
No, it's on the bottom.
Bottom right.
But I don't.
At the very bottom right.
No,
you just about
go
further to your right, where it says 53%, and just to the left of that, there is a screen.
I don't see
a drop down, pull down screen.
I apologize, but I don't see any of that. Everybody's computer is different.
It's really on your PowerPoint program, not on the Zoom.
Well, the Zoom things are taking over the PowerPoint so that I can't see the whole PowerPoint opportunity.
If you click off of your screen anywhere else on the Zoom, that will go away.
What will go away? I apologize. Not sure where you want me to screen, to type, to click.
Okay.
I cannot make the Zoom things disappear.
If you can get your cursor down to the bottom there where
if you hit your escape key, your Zoom will go smaller.
All right, let's see here. No.
Well, what about just if you click on the top,
He
on
he,
the
he couldn't,
slideshow, it will start
right, but he couldn't find it.
at the very top?
That
Yeah.
slideshow, that is part of the PowerPoint, making the slideshow.
Right. But if you click on slideshow, I can't do that, but I do this a lot.
Yeah,
And,
so do I, and you're right.
and that's all you do is hit slideshow and
Exactly.
start slide from wherever.
Ah, I think I'm getting to that. All
You
right.
see where it says
I-
slideshow?
I pulled the Zoom material down. Now I see on my PowerPoint,
Good, good. Hit slideshow.
it
It's right in
doesn't
the
say.
middle. Keep going right.
In the middle.
Right. Go right.
Ah!
In the
Slideshow, right
middle.
there. Click on that.
All right. Now what?
Now
I've-
go to the
Go
next,
down below to from beginning or from current slide, either one. Wherever you want to start.
I'm
Click
on
on
slide.
that. Click
Click on slideshow. Russ, click on slideshow.
I
and the
just,
menu drops down.
Go to the left.
Yeah.
Go to
Now
the,
go
now go
from
down, go
current
to the left where it
slide.
says from
Current
beginning.
slide.
Click
Yeah.
There
on
you
it.
go.
Click on that.
which one?
From
Current
beginning,
slide.
From current slide.
from beginning.
From beginning. Click on that. There you go.
Yay!
Hey.
Yay.
Now what?
All right.
You're
Talk,
good.
Ross, talk.
Okay, let's hope for the best. Next one.
Thank you, Russ.
All right, well, in any case, where I ended up in my rabbit hole search was in a place that I'd never been, which was Sangamon County, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's hometown. And you probably all recognize this photograph of Abraham Lincoln's home. Well, and I discovered when I was in that place, of all things, Lincoln's time capsule. It's a time capsule our generation now has the privilege to crack open 166 years after it was written. And this is a picture, I'm pointing to it, isn't that silly? This is a picture of that time capsule. I recently read a quote about time capsules. The reviewer said they're repositories of objects from the past, objects stowed away in innocence of how history will unfold or how future generations will regard their contents. Well, that's what this is. It's Lincoln's time capsule. It chronicles his 1858 U.S. Senate run, the one in which he and Senator Stephen Douglas scrapped. So the time capsule, as you saw back a second ago, is a tiny 3-inch by 5-inch scrapbook. It's a scrapbook in which Lincoln both pasted newspaper clips and he wrote notes in his own hand. The notes were to a fellow 1858 legislative campaigner, a man who was a good friend, a neighbor, a farmer, and a pedigreed cattle raiser. And his name was James N. Brown, but he went by Captain James Brown because of his service in Kentucky previously in fighting. Yes. And the notes and clippings in this little book are all about the campaign of 1858 when he was running for the Senate. They're what they called the paramount issue, slavery and Negro equality. And over the years, this little time capsule, Lincoln's scrapbook, ended up in a California library. And how it got there, of course, is a whole other story that we'll get into. But along the way, in 1901, this time capsule scrapbook got reprinted in a very limited edition. It was 123 years ago. It was reprinted as what was called a facsimile at the time. And here's the title page of that facsimile. Abraham Lincoln, his book, a facsimile reproduction of the original. Well, shortly thereafter, after it was printed in 1901 and the 2,000 or 3,000 copies that were manufactured, it disappeared. It got lost and it lapsed into total obscurity, where it would still be had I not fallen into the rabbit hole and rediscovered it. Yeah, it's true. So these days I've come to conclude the rabbit hole is less a hole than more like a road. I don't know if any of you ever been on the Lincoln Highway. It's a US 30, and it goes very, very close to the 9/11 flight memorial up in Pennsylvania. In any case, for me, this is more a winding road that dusted off Lincoln's scrapbook's obscurity and brought it to life. And interestingly, it's a road on which I'm still traveling. So first, let's take a look at my road, my journey from inspiration to bring Lincoln's obscure scrapbook to vibrant life. I started down the road about 3 years ago in June of 2021. And that's when I brought that 100-year-old book. That's when I bought another 100-year-old book. It's an equally obscure volume entitled In the Footsteps of the Lincolns. Hopefully you can see the cover of that book. It was written by a very famous turn of the last century author and Lincoln devotee. Her name was Ida Minerva Tarbell, and she was well known for several other books she wrote, but Lincoln was her love, her lifelong love. Ida was born in Pennsylvania in 1857, and she lived until 1943. She remembered, even as an 8-year-old girl, hearing of Lincoln's assassination. To her, in my opinion, it was kind of as shocking as the Kennedy assassination or the events of 9/11 were to us. If you think how you felt when you read when 9/11 happened, or if you're old enough when JFK was assassinated, that's how Ida participated and felt when Lincoln was shot. Over the years in her professional career as a journalist, she became an early Lincoln biographer. Well, reading Ida's book, In the Footsteps of the Lincolns, that she wrote in 1924, I finally got to pages 360 and 361. I'm one of these people that when I start a book, I read it to the end. And it was there that I read about that 1858 scrapbook and the man named Captain Brown and his son and the facsimile. I'll see if we can get to that page. This is a stat of that page, those 2 pages in the book. And most importantly, that in 1924, Ida, the author, felt the scrapbook's facsimile was both a rare and a scarce book. As you can see, it says, it is now a rare document, the edition having been exhausted. Well, that key phrase resonated with me. Then in 1924, that's 100 years ago this year, this 1901 book that was 23 years old was already both rare and scarce. To me, it was kind of a clarion call. I'm kind of a collector of the obscure. And when I read that it was rare and scarce, well, I just had to find it. So, but I looked online, and actually I did, which when it came from this bookseller, it was it showed every bit of its age, but it also showed it was well out of copyright, which gave me an entrepreneurial idea. Might not modern Lincoln followers, people like everybody's a member of this group, also find this old book of interest? And if so, maybe I should reprint it, which in turn led me to think I might enhance such a reprint with comments from a contemporary Lincoln historian. Well, by blind luck, I reached out to Harold Holzer. Harold, as we all know, is one of our nation's most eminent Lincoln historians. And as we all recall, he graced our group's presence just last winter talking about his new book. Well, back in 2021, I had just read Harold's wonderful book, Lincoln Reunion. And I got in touch with him. And to my surprise, given I was such a novice, Harold said he would be delighted to write an introductory essay for my book. Harold's easy acceptance of this junior historian's request reminds me of another Lincoln story. A New Salem acquaintance of Lincoln visited him at the White House. He was seeking a patronage job. The visitor was wholly inexperienced in public affairs, just as I was in Lincoln history writing. Well, notwithstanding, this visitor told the president he would like to be superintendent of the mint. Well, Lincoln was aghast, but he didn't lose his cool. He gently turned the man down, offering him a lesser, more appropriate post, and later was talking to his aides, and he said, "Good gracious, why didn't he ask to be Secretary of the Treasury and be done with it?" Well, then Lincoln added, "Well, when we were young men," because he knew this guy as a young man as well, he said, "I never thought he had anything more than average ability." Of course, back then, I suppose he thought the same thing about me. And now, here I am. But back to Harold and his agreeing to do my introduction. I, of course, said, "Thank you," took yes for an answer. Now I was really deep down that rabbit hole, because now I have Harold writing this wonderful, what turned out to be a wonderful essay, and I had the rest of a book to put together. Of course, I wondered, where was the original scrapbook, of which the facsimile that I had in my hand was the 1901 reproduction? Was it in someone's attic? Had it been shown on Antiques Roadshow? Eventually, and this was the fall of 2021 when we were still coming out of the pandemic, I learned it was in the Huntington Library in Pasadena, California. They happen to have a world-class collection of Lincoln stuff that Mr. Huntington acquired in the second decade of the 20th century. Here's a picture of what that library building looks like. Now in 2021, the Huntington was just reopening from the pandemic, but eventually I was able to order high-resolution scans from the scrapbook, and they were extraordinary in their fidelity, as you can see from the ones I showed. Here's the first page of what Lincoln wrote to a friend, Captain James N. Brown, and you can see how Lincoln's beautiful handwriting, as well as how crisp and clear the reproduction is from what the Huntington had, the original. And so here's what, and this is in, all of this is in my book, of course. And here is Lincoln's note introducing a newspaper clipping about his debate with Senator Douglas in Peoria. And again, this is in Lincoln's hand. And on the opposite page is an actual clipping that Lincoln pasted in, because he kept copies of every speech he gave that was published. And every one of these facsimile pages is reproduced with a transcript in my book. But as my order with the Huntington was being finalized, the Huntington staffer with whom I was working said to me, "You know, Ross, there's a few more pages of notes in the scrapbook. Do you want them?" How could you say no? In for a dime, in for a dollar. I said yes. Well, after getting these extra pages, text and proofs, I wondered who wrote them and what did they say? Well, it turns out these notes were written by James N. Brown, the campaigner to whom Lincoln had given the original scrapbook. Here's what Mr. Brown looked like. I was able to get this wonderful colorized black and white photo of him. And those were pages that were notes that Brown had written to himself. As to what Brown actually wrote, I found a graphologist, somebody who's a handwriting expert. And, excuse me? And she was able to transcribe Brown's handwriting, which was nowhere as easy to read as Lincoln's. Well, weeks later, I decided to go to Pasadena. I just had to see and touch this scrapbook to be fingertip to fingertip with it, as it were. And here's the way the book is actually sitting there in the library, and folks at Huntington let you take a look at it. They don't even ask you to wear cotton gloves. Their feeling is that cotton gloves are not as good as your fingertips when you're looking at old paper. As a bonus, I discovered the Huntington also owned a little bookmark, which, as you can see, says, and I guess I wouldn't have needed a graphologist if I'd been first. Lincoln's part of this book here, pages which follow were prepared by Captain Brown. And the bookmark was left by the Facsimile's co-editor, a man named J. McCann Davis. You can see his signature down at the bottom. I was able to get McCann Davis's photo as well. As well at the library was an auction notice. The auction notice explained where the Huntington got this auction, this book, at an auction in 1914. Well, at about the same time, I commissioned a Gettysburg artist, her name is Wendy Allen, to do the book's cover for me. Wendy is well known for her Lincoln portraiture. And here's her initial Lincoln part of creating the scrapbook. Well, as you can surmise, I was kept being very busy with all of this. And there's another good Lincoln story about how, as president, he often had to spend his time on less than consequential. It seems one afternoon a friend brought a clergyman to visit. Shaking hands with the good reverend, Lincoln invited him to sit down, saying, "I'm now ready to hear what you have to say." The preacher told Lincoln, "Oh, bless you, sir. I have nothing especially to say. I merely called to pay my respects." "My dear sir," said the president, rising promptly, his face showing instant relief and with both hands grasping that of his visitor, "I am very glad to see you indeed. I thought you had come to preach." Well, I didn't have many visitors on my property, but I did decide to buy every book I could find that was related to the facsimile, which is how, over the phone one late afternoon on a Friday in January, I met a rare book dealer who lives in Galena, Illinois, which, as we all know, was U.S. Grant's hometown. His name is Bill Butts. Bill told me, "No, I don't have a facsimile for sale in my shop, but, you know," he says, "I do have one, and it's in my personal library." I thought, that's nice. And then he says, "By the way," and here I'm going to quote him exactly because I'll never forget what he said. He said, "You know, the one I have has some letters inside it." Well, then he says, "But I can't look for it now. I have to help my wife pack for a weekend trip. Can you call me on Monday?" Well, all that weekend, I felt like the lady tied to the railroad tracks in a B movie. I just couldn't come soon enough. In any case, I called him first thing that Monday morning, and Bill read to me all of the letters that were in that book. Amazingly, these letters were written 120 plus years ago, around 1980. And the words in those letters gave me goosebumps even over the phone. All of the letters were written to the very first owner of that particular copy of the facsimile book. His name was DeWitt Miller, and he lived in Cross River, New York. So among the letters, what was there? There was a letter from the facsimile co-editor, Ida Tarbell. Here she is again. Ida's letter to Mr. Miller tells how she, Ida Tarbell, came to publish the facsimile. And then there was a letter, and this is Ida's handwriting, and her letter went on for 4 pages. "You've asked to give me your information about this book. Well, Then there was a letter from the scrapbook's then owner, the man who actually owned it, after James and Brown's late sons had sold it after their dad had passed away. Well, his name was Mr. Lambert, William Lambert, and he was a insurance broker and early Lincoln collector who lived in Philadelphia. And his letter tells how he came to buy the scrapbook. And you see his signature there, July 10, 1901. And lastly, there was a brief note from a New York City rare book dealer. His name was William George D. Smith. He was the guy who sold the scrapbook to Mr. Lambert in 1899. And then, interestingly enough, as agent for Mr. Huntington, bought the book back when Mr. Lambert passed away and bought it in the estate sale as Huntington's agent. And there's a brief note that Smith signed that says how he managed to buy it, but he didn't want to say exactly what was paid. And the $22.50 that you see there was what the book finally sold for at the auction that Huntington paid. Well, Bill Butts and I haggled a bit, and he agreed to sell the book to me with the understanding that I, in turn, would donate it to the Abraham Lincoln Library in Springfield, Illinois, which is precisely what I did. And here's a picture with me and the librarian there. Her name is Christina Schutt. And when I gave her this little book, and that's where it is now, in the Lincoln Library in Springfield, which brings us to the spring of 2022. It would take me about 9 months to do all this work, when Wendy Allen got an email from her friend, that self-famed Lincoln historian, Harold Holzer. Harold told Wendy, here's how Lincoln actually worked while writing his speeches, how he put his left hand to his chin as his right hand penned words. Well, Wendy told me she woke up at 2 o'clock the next morning, went down to her studio and started working on a new canvas, which is what you see right here. Well, when I finally saw that, I instantly concluded it was the perfect cover for my book. And the previous cover, this one here, it became my chapter art. Well, of course, there has to be more serendipity. At the 2022 Abraham Lincoln Association birthday dinner in Springfield, I had a chance to meet another Lincoln historian. His name is David Leroy, and he lives in Boise, Idaho. And he'd be a good one for a Zoom talk, for you, this group, our group. David wrote in 2009 a book titled Mr. Lincoln's Book. It tells the story of how the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates were publicized in an 1860 book whose title tells it all, Debates of Lincoln and Douglas. In 1860, that book was a bestseller. It was published in the spring, and it really helped push Lincoln nomination process. And isn't it interesting, though, that the book's title was not the Douglas-Lincoln debates? After all, Douglas was.
How happy Constitution Day.
Douglas was the
How are
sitting.
you? And thank you for sending the picture. And
It was more, whoever is talking should please be.
Newsletter, I guess you have.
Linda Weiner, mute yourself.
After all, Douglas was the sitting U.S. Senator. It's actually more likely that the title was Lincoln-Douglas Debates, because Lincoln was the mover and shaker behind getting the 1860 debate book published in the first place, is well known. In any case, I discovered that David Leroy's book, that Lincoln, with looking at David Leroy's book in the appendix, that Lincoln had gifted a signed copy of that 1860 book to the very same Captain James N. Brown, the guy who prompted Lincoln to do the scrapbook in the first place. And here you can see Lincoln's note giving the book to Captain Brown in pencil, and then how Charles Brown, James N. Brown's son, eventually gave it to through his heirs to the Huntington Library. Really no surprise that that's where that book happened to have ended up. Well, you can't make this stuff up. And then when my book was in its final production, I got an out of the blue email from a great-great-grandson of Captain Brown. He'd heard of my work in progress because he lives out there in near Springfield. Would I like a photo of Brown's church where he worshiped? Well, of course. I said, yes. Here's a photo of that beautiful church in the cemetery. And the cemetery where Captain Brown is buried. There's his gravesite. Well, stop the press. So here we are, along a rabbit hole road that still hasn't ended. Now, I'm going to conclude by answering a question that I'm sure one of you would like to ask. What exactly does the time capsule reveal? If I could analogize, envision a rainbow whose arc encompasses 6 years. Lincoln's 1864 Emancipation Proclamation is the pot of gold at one end on the right-hand side, and his 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas are at the other end on the left. So this time capsule gives us the Lincoln of 1858, a man at the very beginning of his formal presidential quest. A Lincoln who historian Harold Holzer said in my book's introductory essay, Lincoln faces a genuine challenge. The challenge is the need to achieve success as a politician in order to demonstrate greatness as a leader. This time capsule reveals Lincoln as a man who deeply believes in the Declaration of Independence's creed. All men are created equal. The time capsule shows Lincoln as he hammers away 3 themes. Slavery is wrong. Slavery should not be extended to the states being formed in the West, and slavery should be gradually abolished. And that's what he wrote in the very first page to Captain James N. Brown. Specifically, Lincoln says, and here let me quote his letter to James N. Brown to use with voters, because that's what the purpose of the scrapbook was. When Brown was campaigning, here's what Lincoln says. Quote, Lincoln says, I do not perceive how I can express myself more plainly than I have down in the foregoing. I believe the declaration that all men are created equal, and it's the great fundamental principle upon which our free institutions rest. End quote. Think of Lincoln's political growth as the arc of that 6-year-long rainbow. All men are created equal, stated over and over again in the 1858 debates is at one end, and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1864 is the actual, not illusory, pot of gold at the other. This is General Orders number 1 from the War Department on January 2nd, 1863. The time capsule is a kind of Cliff's Notes of Lincoln's political essence. It shows exactly where Lincoln stood at the beginning of his presidential campaigning. As Harold said, the need to achieve success as a politician in order to demonstrate greatness as a leader. That's why I decided, it's all there. That's why I decided to call what Lincoln wrote in this little scrapbook a time capsule. It's a time capsule our generation has had the privilege to open 166 years later. What a treat. Well, thank you very much, and I'd be glad to answer any questions anybody has.
Thank you for
Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Ross. I particularly liked your PowerPoint slideshow. Very professional, very sharp, one of the best I've seen.
Well, you're very kind. We have to give Loretta Newman a good bit of thank yous for that, because she is very professional at these, and she helped me put it together.
Go for it, Loretta. Thank you very much for helping. It's great. Ross, one thing that you didn't mention that can tell us now, where can people buy your book?
I have a website called By Abraham Lincoln. That's not B-U-Y, but B-Y, AbrahamLincolnBook.com. And had we
Okay.
given this in person, I would have brought a box full, but it's B-Y, AbrahamLincolnBook.com, and
Okay.
books available there.
John O'Brien, can you end the share screen with Ross so I can?
I think Ross has to do that.
Oh, let me do it right now.
To the top.
Top share, I found it.
There you go. All right, now we can see if anyone has a question, go ahead.
I'm not sure whose question is it. Did
Take
you ever?
yourselves off the mute and ask a question. Ross, how hard was it to get into the Huntington Library, and were they skeptical about you at the beginning, that you're not a professional researcher or librarian or anything?
No, they are very, very friendly and very professional. And all I had to do was tell them I'd like to come and see the book. And they were,
Yes.
yes.
And
Tom?
it's free. It's free to get in, right?
No, you have to pay to go to the Huntington. It's
Oh.
well worth the price of admission, because they have beautiful beautiful gardens and lots of other things to see. It's a fabulous, fabulous place.
I think you can get it. Can't you just go into the library and not pay?
No, I believe you
I
have.
used to go there all the time when I lived in LA, because there was a Civil War conference there every year. You're right. It's beautiful, and the people there are terrific.
I don't know the answer to that, John.
First time I ever met Harold Holzer was at the Huntington Library.
All right. Anyone else
Ross.
have a question?
Ross, what was the purpose of him doing this time capsule and sending it?
Well, Captain Brown was a candidate for the legislature. And as we all know, in order to become elected U.S. Senator back in Illinois in the 1850s, you had to be elected by the legislature. So you needed a majority of the legislative votes. And Lincoln needed every single vote he could get. And so he gently twisted Captain Brown's arm, whom we'd known for many years, and with whom he'd served in the legislature about 12 years before. And Brown was kind of retired, but he basically twisted his arm and said, "Could you run one more time?" And then when Brown was campaigning, he found that in Sangamon County, down there in southern Illinois, there was a very, very Democratic kind of district. And so he was getting a lot of static that said Lincoln favored Negro equality. And Lincoln wants to allow people, black people to marry white people. And so Lincoln said, "Let me help you out with your campaign, and let me give you this little scrapbook that has exactly where I stand on this. So when you're talking to people, you can say, here's exactly where Lincoln stands."
How many of these
Question.
how many of these were printed in the original?
In 1901, it was printed in 1901, 1903, and again in 1909. Altogether, there were maybe 4,000 copies manufactured of the facsimile. But most of them, it was printed in kind of poor quality. And so when the first one I bought basically, was almost disintegrated. But I said, there's got to be an original somewhere. And the original being in the Huntington, they were able to make, 2022 scans of the quality that we now can do.
Loretta, go ahead.
Thank you. I had to step out for a minute, so well, more than a minute. I had to take a call that I had. So I don't know, you may have done it, but Ross has been a dear friend, but Did you show the book up like yourself? This is
No.
exquisite. It is this tiny little book, and I've told several people about it, that it's like holding history in your hand. And when you open it up and you see, you know, Lincoln's words in his handwriting, and then it's got the transcriptions, because sometimes handwriting back then, and even today, especially today, they're not teaching script anymore. But anyway, you know, it can be hard to read. But this is a lovely book. It really is. I treasure it. So just wanted to put in a plug.
Well,
I
thank you.
did put the link for you. I put the link in the chat so that anybody can click on it and go right to your website.
Well, thank you, Doris.
When the
I-
meeting's over.
Yeah.
Well, some of us can manage two things.
Ross,
Yes.
what are the top few things you learned about Abraham Lincoln from this scrapbook and from doing your research about
I would say it allowed me to get a much better sense of the kind of, you know, very warm and intelligent and incredibly skillful politician that Lincoln was. I mean, he has so many qualities of leadership that you can't even enumerate them all. But working on this book gave me a chance to get a much better sense of the kind of individual he probably was.
Janet Saros has a question.
Yes, Ross, are you aware, did Lincoln do scrapbooks about other topics? It seems to me I remember reading that this was something he had done more than once, but.
Well, he kept scrapbooks of newspaper clippings. He managed to get every single newspaper that was, you know, from his day that he could get, and anything that was written about him, he cut out and pasted in scrapbooks. And I believe they're all annotated at the library, in the Library of Congress. Those are the actual ones. But this is the only scrapbook that was created that he also wrote notes in. And it's only a scrapbook of a very specific subject. He didn't put stories, anything about anything else. It's only from clippings from his Lincoln and Douglas debates pertaining to the issue of slavery and black and white relations.
Rachel Riley, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Ross, if my memory serves, you were with us at the last Lincoln Forum in Gettysburg. You may have even had a breakout session, and I bought a little book from you. Can you tell me the difference between that one and the new one?
It's the same one. I gave him,
Okay.
Harold was very kind and allowed me to be on the program of the Lincoln Forum in 2022 when I debuted the book. The book was debuted at the Lincoln Forum, and he gave me a little space.
Okay, then it was 2 years ago.
So yes, you bought a copy of the same book that we're talking about today.
Janet?
Anyone else?
Janet had her hand up. Is she there?
She asked a question.
Hmm.
So I wonder if Lincoln kept those scrapbooks of the newspaper clippings himself, or if he had someone else do it, or maybe Mary did it for him.
If I had to guess, I'll bet he did it himself. That would be my own. That would be my own guess. Now, of course, maybe after he became president, he brought some of the old newspapers and had somebody put them together for him. But
have any of those survived that he kept?
Yes, they're in the Library of Congress, I believe. The originals.
So that later became quite a business. Clip services, so companies or celebrities or politicians would hire these clip services that would subscribe to all the newspapers and
Sure.
clippings
Yes.
for them and send it to them, so they knew what.
Well, you see, he was able to be the deus ex machina, as it were, of the book that was published in 1860 in the spring about the Lincoln and Douglas debates. He tried to get it published in Springfield, and he couldn't find a publisher in Springfield to manufacture it for him. So he ended up in Columbus, Ohio, and he took all of the newspaper clippings of his side where they had been transcribed. And then, because he kept everything that Douglas had said that was transcribed in the opposition newspapers of the time, and wrote to Douglas and said, "Is it all? Do you mind? I'm going to publish everything you said. Is there anything else you want to add?" Douglas didn't want to add anything, and so Lincoln had both sides of the Lincoln and Douglas debates from newspaper reports, and that's how that 1860 book got published. And they sold, I don't know, 50,000 copies in the spring of 1860. It was a very, very, but it was a real bestseller. And it definitely helped Lincoln's case running for president in 1860.
So Ida Tarbell was most famous as a muckraker. She was the one who took on John D. Rockefeller famously.
Yes.
Helped lead to the antitrust decision that broke up the Standard Oil monopoly. What was her book about Lincoln? What was it about? She was a fan of Lincoln, right? So it was
well, she started her professional career working for, and I apologize, I don't have the magazine name right at the top of my head, but she
McClure.
wrote, what was it?
McClure's magazine.
They hired her as kind of a reporter, freelance writer in the late 1880s to do a life of Lincoln. And she wrote a 4-volume life of Lincoln. And that was before she did her other work. And then throughout her professional career, she just loved following writing about Lincoln. And so it was only in the 1924 or 23 when she wrote the book called In the Footsteps of the Lincolns that I found on page 360 this story. That book, In the Footsteps of the Lincolns, is available today as a reprint. And it follows Lincoln's ancestors from when the very first Lincoln came from England in 16-something, settled in Massachusetts. And then Lincoln's forebears kept moving west and west and west. And finally, we get to our Abraham Lincoln, 300-some pages later, and then writing about his campaign in 1858. And that book ends with Lincoln being elected president of the US. It doesn't follow his presidential career. Ida's book ended with Lincoln being elected.
So in all, she wrote 5 books about Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln and the Lincolns.
She wrote
5
lots.
volumes.
She wrote, I'll bet, a dozen books in one way or the other relating to Lincoln.
Really?
Yes. It's sort of one of those little known things about her. She's mostly known as the muckraker, but she was really somebody who made Lincoln her lifelong quest. She never was married, and incidentally, Ida's life and my life correspond for about a year, because I was born in 1943 and she died in 1943. It gives me goosebumps to say that. So I kind of feel I'm carrying on her legacy a little bit.
Anybody else?
Well, not a question, but since you had Wendy Allen as your illustrator there, well, a lot of us in this group know Wendy, and she's presented to us, and this group won the Wendy Allen Award at the Lincoln Forum. Should mention that too.
Well, she's a wonderful lady, and Wendy has made portraiture of Lincoln her entire career. That's all she paints.
I've been to her studio more than once because I've spent a lot of time in Gettysburg.
Well, she's right on the main drag of Gettysburg.
Baltimore Street, yeah.
That Lincoln walked down on his way to give his famous speech. Or he didn't walk down, I guess he rode in a carriage.
Okay. Anyone else? Well, thank you, Ross.